your pain point sometimes becomes your passion. The story that they're telling themselves that they're feeling deeply isn't necessarily true. And they can shift that narrative. Their identity is like so wrapped up in their performance. How you perform in your soccer game on Sunday isn't who you are as a person. Focus on the behavior, not the outcomes. Praise the behavior, not the outcomes. I want to help them find that pathway a little bit earlier on and know like this is who I am and this is how I want to show up. I am valued and loved and good. It is this beautiful process that athletes get to go through and learn so much about
Yeah.
themselves, who you are and what you value and how you want to show up in the world.
Welcome to the Differentiation Podcast. My name is Michèle Sorgaroli. I'm your host, and today we have the distinct pleasure of being joined by Margaret Butler. Margaret is an educator, a coach, a mother, and a former athlete who has run for Canada on the world stage. And what she carried home wasn't just medals. She carried home a deep understanding of what sport can be and do for a young person's sense of self, for better or for worse. Margaret is a certified mental performance coach. She is the founder of Leap Mental Performance and the woman behind 2 decades of female empowerment work, including founding Comera and Amplify Girls. Margaret's on a mission to make sure that sport is never just an empty vessel, and she's here today to help us fill it with something that lasts. Margaret, thank you for joining us. This is going to be a fun conversation.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful introduction.
Oh, it's a treat. This is a delight. I'm loving where this is going to go, and I'm very, very excited. I love the language around sport being an empty vessel. I want to dig into that in a minute, but I want to start with we had a previous conversation where something really stood out for me, and you said that the parents of your clients, if you will, of the children, have told you that your work is transformational for their child. And
Yeah.
I'd love to hear just a little bit more about that as you tell us more about what you do and help us get to know you a little better.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me here. Yeah, I feel very fortunate with the work that I get to do with young women. I feel very fortunate that parents trust me with their children in a very formative time.
Mm,
I like to use the word transformational in all of my work, from the work that I did working with nonprofits and adolescent girls around the world, and right up into the work that I'm doing with Leap right now. I find often young women, if they can have someone else to talk to besides their parents, and it's no fault of the parent, right? There's a natural separation that
mm,
happens, and if they can find someone for their kid, a mentor, a coach, or just someone that they can connect with, that they can
mhm,
speak to, it's so, so helpful. And a lot of the work that I do is just being someone who listens, and who also provides tools and tells them that, the story that they're telling themselves that they're feeling deeply isn't necessarily true. It's just something that's
mm,
on repeat in their brains, and they don't have to believe it. And they can shift that narrative too, and they can
mm,
create the narrative that they want. And it's so fun to be able to help them realize that and create a pathway of power and understanding about how their brain works and what direction they want to head in. And so, I use sport as a vehicle for a lot of the
mhm.
work that I do with young women. But it's much bigger than that, right? It's how do we take young women and support them through a really tricky time in their lives?
Yeah.
Teenage years can be incredibly beautiful, but also incredibly challenging.
For any of us
Um,
who have been a teenager once, all of us. Right.
um, and
Yeah.
just help them sort of build that pathway going forward for future years as they go on to become leaders and mothers and whatever it is that they're moving towards.
Choose to pursue. I love that. You landed on the word transformational, and you said, that's something that is a part of your lexicon, if you will. What is it about transformation that feels so important to you?
Um, I think the idea of transformation first came forward when I was working in the nonprofit world. And I really landed on this idea of having a deep impact being really, really important. In the
Mm,
nonprofit world, and I mean, I think in the business world too, it's always about scale and how can we reach as many girls as quickly as possible,
mm,
by giving them a pencil or, a book and saying, okay, job done. We've hit our targets. And for me, when I first started working internationally and working with adolescent girls and working with Partners in Health, which was the organization I was working at first, it was really about how do we transform lives? How do we make sure that every life is valued
mm,
equitably? And for me, it was, one girl at a time, making sure that what we do has an impact on her life and her family's life. And I've kind of held on to that as
mm,
something, as a value that I hold in terms of the work that I do now as well, of like, of course, hey, if you can blurt out massive numbers of impacting thousands and thousands of young women, that's great. But I want to make sure that my values of knowing that those numbers are evidence of transformational change and of true,
mm.
honest support for the girls that I was working with and I continue to work with today.
Yeah. Um, I think you're touching on something very interesting. And what I noted was the concept of impact versus scale. And I
Mhm.
felt like there was, I don't want to say tension, but I felt like there was something in that relationship for you. Could you
Yeah.
expand on that for us?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It is I mean, going back again to global development, it's a constant narrative of, we're going to give money to organizations that can reach as many people as possible, which is good in certain
Mm,
instances. It's beautiful, right? We want to have healthcare systems that serve everyone or education systems that serve everyone. But what is missed in those moments too are the small community-based organizations who are supporting communities in very, very meaningful ways.
mm,
And they often don't get the funding, they often don't get the support. And it's sort of like one or the other has to be true. And my
mm,
advocacy over, many years was no, like both can be true at the same time. And we need to be investing in community-based initiatives just as much as we invest in global scale and making sure that systems are working. But we kind of skim over those localized approaches because we don't see them as scalable or big enough. And I think they're missing the idea that scale can be depth and it doesn't have to necessarily always be breadth of impact as well.
mm, hmm. Yeah, that is a big discussion of depth versus breadth, isn't it? Where did this come from? Like, when did you were working in nonprofit, but all of this started before it? You were an athlete yourself, right? From
Yeah.
what age? Like, I'm assuming you started fairly young.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us a little, when did your athletic journey start as a young girl?
Oh boy. I was a very intrinsically motivated young thing.
Okay.
Had an older brother who I constantly tried to beat in everything. I can't remember a day where I wasn't deeply, deeply competitive. It was just that's how
Mm,
I'm hardwired. And so I started very young. And I grew up on Bowen Island, and we didn't have a lot of
mm,
organized sports in the 1980s.
right.
Um, so I connected with running at a young age. Both my parents were active. They were sort of
Uh,
recreational runners, and I would do it here and there. And we would have little cross country races that we would go into Vancouver to have, and I would do quite well in those. So much so that my mother, I apologized to her continuously. Um, she said, you would come in second once in a blue moon and you would sit there just sobbing. And I had
oh,
to just sort of be like, oh, I'm sorry for my child. So I was hardwired from a very young age, and just loved I loved to compete. I loved to push myself. I think there was part of it too was I was a pretty anxious child, and I think I learned at a very young age that sport and being outside and being active and running around this little island kind of helped counter that anxiety a little bit. And so I think that's why it sort of molded me and helped me sort of continue along that path.
Exactly. You were quick to connect that. I'm hearing that that was on your own as you were figuring out how the sport was helping you calibrate and
Yeah, and I don't
fulfilling parts of you too, right?
absolutely. I don't know if I connected that at that age.
Okay.
Like I don't think I could have named anxiety at a
Right.
young age. I think it was more just like, like the feeling that
Yeah.
it gave me. And in retrospect now,
hmm
yes, as someone who's aware of that, yeah, I can point it out. But at that point, I think it was just more like I was very intuitive in like how I was feeling, and
Right.
it helped me with how I was feeling.
I love that. I think that's, you're really touching on something so interesting because our intuition does help us access that feeling and our better path, and you called it our powerful pathway of power.
Mhm.
It really does give us access to that. And sometimes I think we tend to maybe neglect it or devalue it or ignore it, and
Mhm.
not necessarily listen to how our intuition is guiding us and allow ourselves to feel the results of that. So I'm sensing that, yes, you mentioned that you were already intuitive and it just kind of, you just followed that feeling, is what I'm
Yeah,
hearing. Is that
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
What did you notice changed for you as a teenage athlete? Where did this realization come that sport that can be for better or for worse on your sense of self?
Yeah. I think again, a lot of it sort of came afterwards, like sort of
Oh, okay.
looking back at my career as an
hmm
athlete. I loved running. I also played basketball. I was sort of an all-round athlete. I enjoyed everything. When I went to high school into Vancouver, it was sort of my opportunity to try all the sports.
Right.
But I kept on sort of drifting back to running as something that I just excelled at. And I think, one of the challenges I faced was it was something because I was good at it, it became kind of my identity and my
Mm,
value for myself too, of like, well, if I'm winning, then of course I need to continue doing this sport. And if I'm losing, then I'm not a good person or not,
yeah.
valuable enough as an individual.
Mm,
And as a teenager, I deeply linked those two things together of like, well, I'm valuable, I'm likable because I'm very good at sports.
mm,
And it took me a very long time to de-link those two those two things. I went on to university and ran at the University of Washington, and same thing. And I had a very, very challenging university career where I sort of was very up and down, injured, and struggled a lot with, who I was and the value I was bringing. And so much so that, I finished my university career. I decided I was going to go traveling in Europe, quit running, done. I was totally burned out, and went and traveled on my own in Europe, and all of a sudden was like that odd girl in the hostel who was getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning and going running.
oh,
And after
interesting.
several months, I came back and as I was traveling, I was doing a lot of writing and reflecting and just being on my own. It was the first time I was not Margaret the runner. I was
Uh-huh.
just Margaret in the world.
hmm hmm
Um, and I realized I still loved to run, and
mm
that I could choose to run. I didn't have to run. It wasn't like anything that anyone was pressuring me to do or that I was being paid to do. And so I was able to come back to Vancouver and choose to run again. And that's when I had a lot of success running internationally and on the national team because I was able to kind of like switch my mindset a little bit and come into running as someone who was choosing to be there and could kind of tinker a little bit more with my mindset and how I wanted to show up as an
Hmm.
individual.
How do
Yeah.
you think that impacted your mindset from a before and after perspective? We heard a little bit, but I'd love you to expand on that further.
Yeah, I mean, um, I think I was just more aware of it as a professional athlete and curious about it rather than something that I was battling as a teenage
Mm,
athlete. I would finish races when I was a teenager, provincial or national championships, having done quite well. And there was such a massive relief of like not having to do it again for another year, like just and I would do it again the next year, even though I felt like terrified of doing it.
right.
And when I was able to come back to it with a different perspective, it
Hmm.
was more me choosing and me recognizing like, okay, how do I tinker with this brain, this mindset? And I read a ton and tried to
Yeah,
understand how other professional athletes were doing it. And mind you, this was still at a time when people weren't really talking about this all that
right.
much.
Hmm.
I think it was like in the I can't remember exactly when it was when Phil Knight started doing it with like the Bulls and like Bryant doing meditation and talking
Mm,
about mindset. And I was just always so curious about it. And a couple of runners at that time had written like books, bios about themselves and how they had struggled and ways in which they had approached the sport. And so I loved the idea of being like, well, how do I figure this out for myself? What does this look like? And
hmm.
getting more curious around the power of the brain and how you can approach races in different ways. And so it sort of like the second phase became more this curiosity of like, well, what does it mean? What does it look like? And also freedom. Like no one is telling me I have to do this. I can, and I went and got trained as a teacher and I taught and I had different jobs while I was running too. And it was sort of a liberation of like, yeah, I can run and find joy in my running. Uh,
Hmm.
and also be curious about like how our brains work and
Hmm.
why we are the way we are.
Hmm. I'm hearing so much similarity with this idea of having to do something, being so deeply attached to one's identity,
Yeah.
which feels a bit locked up and
Mhm.
demanding.
Mhm.
That's kind of the energy that I'm hearing from you
Yeah.
versus when you move into a position of choosing. You said things like, being able to be curious and tinker with my mindset and the sense of freedom. And there's more joy because I reconnected with the joy of the run,
Yeah.
or the experience there versus the have to, and that identity protection that is not liberating, but rather constraining, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And when your identity is tied to something that you're like that is outcome based, right? Then it's crushing when you're not doing well and your identity just feels like it's fallen apart. And then,
Absolutely.
being able to move into a new mindset where you're like, wow, my identity is all of these things. I can go travel in Europe. I can be Margaret the writer, or Margaret the
Hmm.
thinker, or Margaret the teacher, and Margaret the friend. And all of a sudden, you're not
Hmm.
dependent on one thing. And it becomes, yeah, it is liberating to find that
Hmm.
and to know that you have choice.
Hmm.
When you're young, you don't realize how much choice you have. And especially when you're so deeply tied to one thing. And I loved it. I was passionate about it. I'd drawn the Olympic rings on my wall and just felt like that was who I needed to be. And so it wasn't like anyone was holding me to it. My
Right.
like my parents certainly they were the type of parents who were like, oh, you've got a race, great, good luck, see you later. Like they weren't the ones who were driving me.
Oh,
It was all
interesting.
me. And trying to like figure out who I was. And so it
Hmm.
took that sort of transition to figure it out.
Mm. I'm curious about your relationship. You know, you said it was all me, and you had an older brother.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you said you're always trying to keep up with him, right? Which I think is a very, I'm an older sister, so
Yeah.
I'm on the other end of that. But as a younger person, we see that with our kids because, you know, the younger one has tended to try to keep up, or certainly when she was younger, she did. Younger girl, older boy. Um, how do you think that impacted your sense of being competitive or wanting to pursue that next level of performance for yourself?
Mhm. I think so, like working with athletes today and having kids, I have two daughters who are athletes as well in soccer, and I find it fascinating with like parental dynamics. So
Mm,
my parents, while incredibly supportive, they were not the ones who were at the track meet, cheering for
mm,
me every single time. Like they got me to practice and got me home, but they weren't on my neck about
mm-hmm,
competing and
mm.
performing and
Interesting.
how I needed to sleep and eat and perform. Like that was not that was not them. I was the driver. And today I see a ton around like parents being the drivers with
Mm,
athletes. And it's really, really challenging. And it's really hard on some of the athletes that I work with, quite frankly. My dynamic with my brother, like he was, 3 years old. I mean, he did different things than I did. And we had friendly competition, but he wasn't really a driver. I mean, I think I looked up to him
right.
certainly,
Yeah.
but he was like, I'm not running. I am not doing anything that that girl is doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he did like rugby and soccer,
Yeah.
all the sports that I was not doing. Uh, but I would imagine growing up, I was always, like we would race up hills together and compete in that way. But it wasn't like as competitive.
Yeah.
But I think it was, I think I appreciate that my parents too let me
Mm,
drive the
mm,
ship because
mm-hmm.
it meant that I wanted it. And it had nothing to do with their egos or who they were or who
Right.
they thought they were. It was about me. And that enabled me to become a good athlete because I was the one who was making sure that I was taking care of myself and showing up to practice and doing all
Right.
the extra things. And
Right.
today, unfortunately, you see it kind of the other way around where you question, like, is this about you?
Mm-hmm.
Or is
Mm-hmm.
this about your kid?
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of
Mm-hmm.
have to remind parents of, like, if they're going to be great athletes and if they want to go professional, then you've got to follow their lead. You can't be driving the ship for them.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, again, you're touching on themes that we talk about differentiation. And
Mhm.
in differentiation, you're touching on a major theme that I see all the time with my clients about who is driving you, right? Is it your
Yeah.
clients who are driving you? Is it industry that's driving you? Or are you internally driven? And what that means, just like you talked about, there's have to and choose to.
Yeah.
And having to, I'm just noticing so many similarities when an entrepreneur feels that they have to do something in order to compete or in
Yeah.
order to be valued, in order
Yeah.
for their identity to hold. That
Yeah.
having to is so restrictive and it actually doesn't
Yeah.
allow them to find pathways to their own power, to your
Right.
point, right? In
Right.
your
Right.
language. The decision of choice is different. And releasing that identity that we've carried for so long is such a big, big part of this. And
Mhm.
also then there's the tension around the identity and who's driving that identity or where
Mm.
that identity, and it might be, from past stories or what have you. It could be connection with parents and wanting to be accepted and loved and all that, or it could be, related to industry acceptance, that kind of thing. But there's usually a piece that is like, what happens to my identity if I
Yeah.
don't meet the expectations and vision, if you will, that others have for me?
Oh, absolutely.
I see that a
Absolutely.
lot in my work. And you've already referred to this. How do you help people, your clients, your teenagers, typically, how do you help them connect to an identity that's independent of those who might be driving them in this case,
Mm.
parents?
It's such a good question. And I want to say one thing first that like as you were talking about that shift, because
Mm,
when I went from being a runner, so I got injured and fully decided for myself, new chapter, I'm, going to work
yeah.
internationally. But what ended up happening, and I would say that was like phase one of letting go
Uh,
of my identity. And phase two of my identity was I'm now Margaret the do-gooder. Right.
oh,
And and I definitely tied a lot of my value and worth to the work that I was doing and the impact that I was having and feeling good
mhm.
about it. Not bad things, right? Not bad things.
Yeah.
But when things weren't going well at work, or I wasn't able to fundraise enough, or there was a conflict or something happening, it just took me out, right?
Right.
Completely and impacted, not only, my being, but like my environment. And
Hmm.
after sort of, retiring from international development, I had to do some further deep, deep work on who am I as Margaret, the person, like the
Yeah.
individual in the world. And like that took me 40 some odd years to be able to like really do that work and spend time. And, like what a gift I had some time to really think about it and choose what I wanted to
Hmm.
do next. But first I had to like kind of detangle this idea of like my value in the world being something that I do versus just being a person who exists. So like for me, it was quite a lengthy process that I can
Hmm.
look back on now. And I'm grateful that I would imagine it will continue as I continue to evolve. Um, so like getting back to your initial question, I find it fascinating working with young athletes. And we spend a lot of time talking about the different pieces of who they are and the things that they're curious about and the things
Hmm.
that they want to try and naming. I mean, it's basically just like naming all of the things that you are. And I liken it to like a book. And I,
Hmm.
I ask them when I do workshops, I ask athletes to like write on a number of different pieces of paper and stack those pieces of paper together and show that it's really hard to rip a big stack of paper,
Hmm.
right? But if you have one individual paper that your identity is based on, it's pretty easy to rip. And so I try and use just little examples like
That's
that to
great.
bring kids back to like your identity is beautiful and diverse and full of many things. Simple as like you can be a daughter, a sister, a granddaughter, like that's part of your identity. You can be someone who's curious about music or
Hmm.
art and we spend time and the work that I do is very in depth with individuals just talking about that and trying to de-link like how you perform in your soccer game on Sunday isn't who you are as a person. You are you know Sarah who plays soccer. You're not Sarah the soccer player.
Right.
And so it's fascinating, I think with young minds, they're still trying to figure it out. And I think if you can just sort of plant that seed for them and have it be there and have it be something that's kind of like lodged in the back of their mind, that it'll continue to evolve. And when those
Hmm.
hard moments do come up, that they'll have something there that they can kind of come back to and be like, oh yeah, I'm going to go back to that list that I created and I'm going to
Hmm.
keep adding to it. Or I'm going to like remind myself, yeah, okay, I am all of these beautiful, wonderful things. And like, I want to honor that instead of, feeling crushed that something didn't work out the way it needed to work out. And, I mean, one of the key things that we also talk about is like you can feel crushed. You should, like
Yeah.
if you lose a race or a competition, like that's sad and that's hard. But then what are you going to do afterwards? And how do you move through that? And what's the behavior, that you're going to have afterwards? I love talking about identity. I think it's
I can
fascinating
hear
and
that.
ever evolving,
Yeah. No, no,
as we know.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I can hear that. I wrote down a more expansive identity. That's where I was hearing this idea of the stack of papers and this concept of this one part is only just a sliver or a wedge in a book or in a chapter or in a circle, if you will. this idea of expansive identity. And as we're exploring that further, what what do you see in your clients when in these young girls, when they start to realize their expansive identity? What happens that's transformational for them?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is it's a freedom. Every athlete I talk to, every single athlete, male, female, what they want to feel is they want to feel free when they
Mm,
play. And they've recognized that feeling. They've accessed it. They've felt it. And what happens when all of a sudden they're so worried about their sport or how they're performing it all comes kind of crushing down on them because they're so afraid of making a mistake because their identity is like so wrapped up
yeah.
in their performance. And so when you can help them release that, then all of a sudden they're able to get back to playing free again and not worrying about, what so and so is going to say or think about them on the field,
Mhm.
or, how their parent is going to respond or their coach. And being able to like access that space again for so many
Mhm.
athletes is critical. And it really does come down to like the idea of identity that like no, people aren't going to value you any less as an individual or, love you any less as an individual because you didn't score the goal or win the race. They love you because you're showing up and trying your best. And that's hard for athletes to get to, but eventually they can get there. And that's the joy. Like all of a sudden, and my I work with athletes for about 3 or 4 months, and about 70%, 75% of the way through, they hit this moment where all of
Yeah.
a sudden they're like, oh, it's
Yeah.
working.
It's working. Exactly.
And I played this game and I just felt so different. And I used all these ways in which I can talk to myself. And it was amazing. And yeah,
Yeah.
and you're like, yeah, because all of a sudden you're back to just playing the sport that you love. And the
Mhm.
association with all of that other stuff is kind of let go. And we spent enough time working on their subconscious to kind of like move that to the back and bring their like joy and love and freedom of the game forward again, or sport, or whatever
Mhm.
competition is that they're doing.
Fantastic.
And
I
isn't
just
that what we all want in life?
totally like this is I'm kind of seeing what I've jotted down because I always take notes because I always want to capture the big
Yeah.
ideas. You started with this idea that you're loved because you're showing up and trying your best and playing something you love. That's
Mhm.
why you're loved. That's why you're valued. That's why you're appreciated. And there's freedom in that. And I feel like when we're young, or certainly in sport or early in our career, when
Mhm.
we're following, when that we have that freedom to just try because we're not good enough to be recognized for outcomes or that piece, right? So
Yeah.
we're just loved and appreciated at work for showing up and trying and playing our best and doing our best, whether it's sport or business,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
And then what happens is we start to have success.
Yeah.
And then our identity starts to crystallize around that success, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
then the trying is no longer enough. It's the performing that is being reinforced,
Absolutely.
right? And so that's what I'm hearing. And what happens is that identity can become so entrenched in somebody that,
Mhm.
and what you talked about was the concept of expanding that identity again to what it once was, right? And more mature version of it. So it's more expanded and delinked from that one thing.
Yeah.
And then you brought back the word freedom
Yeah.
and joy again, which is where we started when we were loved because we were showing up and trying our best and just playing something, doing something that we love, right? We're bringing passion, enthusiasm, and curiosity. How does that land for you? Is that what I'm
Yeah.
hearing here?
Chef's kiss. Beautiful.
Nice.
It's beautiful. And I think, I want to bring it back to parents around this as well,
Mm,
as that it is so important for parents and their role in which they
mm,
play in this process. And I remind parents of this all the time of like focus on the behavior, not the outcomes. Praise the behavior, not the outcomes. When they come home from a soccer game or when you're on the sideline in a, basketball game or race or whatever it may be, praise how they're showing up and the effort that they're putting forward. Don't ask them what the score is afterwards or, how many points they got or what time they ran. Just ask them how they felt,
Yeah.
and tell them that you love them regardless and like you just love watching them compete. Because I think parents unintentionally start asking about outcomes,
Hmm.
and that like reinforces this idea of like I'm valued based on my performance. And what we want to encourage parents to do is to move away from outcomes and just be like, how'd you show up? Were you a great teammate today? Were you, bringing positive energy to everyone? Great. If you won, amazing. I love that. What do you think contributed to that? How did you,
Hmm.
and sort of getting curious versus praising just like the success, because then that adds like layers of
Layers.
pressure to an athlete that just isn't needed.
Yeah.
And so I want to like throw that tidbit in there for parents who might be watching of like show up, like reinforce behaviors and just try your best to move away from like questions around outcomes. And that, applies beyond sport too.
Beyond, yeah. Well, you're touching on something really interesting because cycles continue too, right? So a
Mhm.
lot of times parents don't know, or business leaders don't know because that's the environment they were encouraged in, right? That was the
Mhm.
model that they were encouraged through. So sometimes that identity piece, it just carries on around that
Yeah.
performance because that's all that people know
No.
through environments. And, identity can get connected to each other, certainly in families or in business
Mhm.
cultures, business partners. Identity starts getting connected with the performance of others, right? So there's a whole, it's a big piece. The key here is what we're really talking about is the essence of the individual being in a
Mhm.
position of choice to pursue freely what it is that allows them to experience joy for the pure love of the game, whatever
Yeah.
that game is, right?
Yeah.
That's what
Yeah.
we're trying to do. So beautiful. Now, there's a piece here that's come up so many times. I want to just pivot a wee bit around this concept of curiosity because you've said that word, excuse me, you've said that word so many times.
Yeah.
So where is this curiosity coming from, Margaret? Like go back and were you always curious as a kid, or did this start to develop later as you were learning to tinker with mindset? Where did this really become more of a present thing for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. Curiosity has always been part of my being.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been someone who's asked a lot of questions, and like trying to understand things, who has been curious about the world. I think I am a child of immigrants. My parents are South African. They came here. I was born here. We lived in South Africa for a year when I was quite young. And so and we would go back and visit family and kind of travel in the summers. My parents were both teachers. And they were curious about the world. They were curious, and I think they instilled that in me and my brother. And being able to see beyond our little island, Bowen Island, that there was a world out there that was waiting to be discovered. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I think that was part of where it came from. And then I was just fortunate along the way to have friends and mentors who were curious as well, who instilled that in me. And I just, one of my passions is always just how do I continue to evolve and grow and learn? I love to learn and I love to consume information and like see what's happening in the world. So it is a deep value of mine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if everyone could just be a little more curious, maybe the world would be a bit better too, right? Curious about other people's opinions, curious about their views of how the world works. I think it is something that we could all use a little bit more of.
Mm-hmm. In your work, what is the role of curiosity?
Mm. Yeah. So in my work now, it's so central with kids of like just being curious about how your brain works, being curious about, why you're feeling the way you're feeling, noticing the thoughts and the feelings and how it's showing up in your body and in your brain. I have a session where I'm like, just be a scientist. Be a scientist on your own body. Like, why are you reacting that way? What are the triggers? What's happening? And what are the things that work for you?
Mm.
So curiosity is just it's across the board. It's an imperative with the work that I do for
Oh,
sure.
interesting. What do you do if you don't have a willing participant in the curiosity journey?
Ah! That's where my job comes in, where my curious mindset comes in.
Hmm.
I just ask a lot of questions, like I think thankfully most kids are pretty willing to have a conversation. And when I can sort of ask different questions and like lead them down a bit of a pathway around thinking. And a tool that I use a lot of is writing. We do a ton of writing. I also use art as well. When a kid might not feel comfortable writing, we use art, different modalities of thinking and feeling, or ways in which they can get their thoughts and feelings out. And that enables them to like process and then come back. A lot of this work is just patience and, being an external person, I think it's a benefit, right? Where I don't ever feel frustrated or anything along those lines. I just am like, oh, okay, like how do we dig in a little? This is great.
There you go. So you're inspired by that in a way,
Oh
or it
yeah.
certainly there's a spark. You've got such a lovely energy about you, and curiosity. You've used the word a lot, but your energy evokes it. It just expresses curiosity. Even your
Yeah.
energy. There's something about the words that you said, where a world waiting to be discovered,
Yeah.
a world waiting to be discovered. And whether it's our physical world, if you will, what I'm also
Mhm.
hearing for you, Margaret, is that there's a world internally to be discovered
Yeah.
as well, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And
Absolutely. It's endless.
endless, yeah. And I would imagine that that started as you were starting to tinker with your mindset. That's the language that I'm kind of grasping onto at this point, that there was a shift from the external curiosity more to an internal curiosity at that time.
Yeah.
What do you think was fueling that? Like how did you know to start exploring internally as opposed to the external journey, if you will?
I think because it was something that I struggled with so deeply for so long. And I really wanted to understand it of why I was feeling the way I was feeling, why I was having the thoughts I was having. And I continue to like have to unravel it. I sort of call it like peeling back the endless layers on the onion.
Yeah.
But it was, I like to say that your pain point sometimes becomes your passion. And
Yeah.
for me, it was something that I really, really struggled with. And I really feel passionately that and know that other people struggle with it too, right? We know that.
Hmm.
And I want to make sure that young women and men and youth have access to tools that help them understand their mindset and help them, figure out who they are rather than it getting to a critical point.
Hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, for me, it really was just like it was something that I felt so, so deeply and struggled with so, so deeply that I wanted to like understand it a little bit more or a lot more
Hmm. Hmm.
and be able to move through it. And it's an ongoing journey. That's the beauty of it is that I keep on figuring more out about myself and the world and how I want to show up.
Right. That continuous curiosity and evolution, right? Grow and
Yeah.
learn.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, you said pain is your passion,
Hmm.
pain is your purpose. I've heard that as well.
Yeah.
Um, there's nothing quite like a sense of empathy when we can bring that to our work.
Hmm. Hmm.
When
Yeah.
when I say that, what does that mean for you in the work that you do today?
Mm. Uh, I think the one thing that I'm very much an empath, and I
Mm,
care deeply about all of the athletes that I work with, and my community at large, and
mm,
it is it is, I think, my power. And also, it's something that I have to be careful of because I really take it all in.
mm,
And I really care about how the clients that I work with are doing and performing, and I am like deeply invested. And I also have to make sure that I have that in a container as well. And that has been something that I've learned too, of like I can't, like I can only go so far with athletes and their families, and I will be their supporter and advocate and cheerleader, but I can't like lose myself in that. And that's something that I've learned throughout, right? Throughout my work internationally, working with incredible organizations, of like I can't lose myself in it, otherwise it doesn't benefit anyone. And so it is something that I bring wholeheartedly to the work that I do, but also have to sort of manage it to a certain extent, too.
there you are
Yeah.
talking about identity again in a way, aren't you? Didn't use the word, but as you said, I
Yeah.
didn't want to lose myself in it. So it's so interesting, isn't it? How at one end of the spectrum, if you will, the identity is so forged in one thing that it can't be moved. And of course, there's a lack of freedom, a lack of self, and all of that inside of that. And then on
Mhm.
the other end, there's when you lose yourself, you have no identity at all,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's what I'm getting from this
Yeah.
is that you completely lose yourself. And then of course it has the same impact in terms
Yeah.
of your sense of freedom, your sense of joy, your sense of just self-worth, being loved, etc. So somehow I like to say always that the magic is in the middle.
Oh, absolutely.
It's
I
always
think
in the
that's it.
middle.
Yeah. Well,
There's
and
something.
it's been part of the learning that I've done,
Yeah.
right? Is that, when I was in my international sort of phase of work, I did lose myself in it.
Yeah.
And now I'm in another phase where I've learned that lesson. And while I care deeply, I don't lose myself in it anymore.
Right.
Like and I've been able to find that balance. And I think that's why this work is so good right
Hmm.
now, is that I've gotten myself to a very, very solid, powerful place,
Mm.
and have this, decades of experience to
Yeah.
build on.
Oh, it's beautiful. It's
Yeah.
the pathway to power, right? Or the
Yeah,
pathways
there
to
you go.
power. And without I talk about this a lot in my work as well, but the ends of the spectrum, it's almost impossible. Like your identity, I'm just using your example, your identity as a young girl being so connected to running, Margaret
Mhm,
the runner,
mhm,
to Margaret the do-gooder in nonprofit, right? Those two identities, although vastly different, were the extremes.
mhm,
One was very much about yourself, and the other one was very much about others.
mhm,
And then the pathway to power, the pathway to our greatest gifts, the pathway to our joy, the pathway to bringing forward our potential, and all of that is in knowing where those are so that we can calibrate
mhm,
towards center and we can be ourselves and um, be aware of what it looks like to be empathetic and to be,
mhm.
connected with others. And you talked about community in this conversation as well. We haven't really touched on that, but that's where the community piece really comes in. It's self and others, and then that blend is
Yeah,
um, is the pathway
yeah.
to one's greatest power. That's the story I'm hearing today.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think my goal with a lot of the work that I'm doing now is helping like young people access that sooner.
Yeah.
Like I had my journey. I love my journey. I'm so grateful for what
Mm,
I have gone through and experienced and lived. But man, I want athletes to know this about themselves earlier so that they can go on and own their power, in jobs, in
Hmm.
being a professional athlete or whatever it is that they go through. Like, I want to help them find that pathway a little bit earlier on and know like this is who I am and this is how I want to show up and like whether it is as an athlete or as just a human in the world, I am valued and loved and good. And I think that
Hmm.
is a critical part of the work that I do is like yes, you can be a phenomenal athlete and you can also be like this incredible person in your own right too. And the two can exist side by side and be beautiful, but they don't necessarily have to be linked and be who you are.
Be
In a,
restrictive in that way.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I opened with you want to make sure that sport is never just an empty vessel and you want to fill it with something that lasts. So as we come to the conclusion of this conversation, what are you filling the vessel with, Margaret?
Mm, mm. Um, so the vessel for me is just, a lot of what we talked about of understanding their value with sport, and understanding who they are beyond sport and having sport be such a beautiful teacher, right? Of being able to fail, being able to succeed, being able to show up and put in the hard work day in, day out, being able to create community, understanding how to navigate relationships and
Mm,
coaches and making teams and not making teams and taking all of that beautiful learning and being able to apply it to become a future female leader or whatever it may be, whatever pathway you take, but recognizing that it's not just about just making that team or just becoming a university athlete or a professional athlete. It is this beautiful process that athletes get to go through and learn so much about
yeah.
themselves. And my desire is that athletes are able to like slow it down and recognize,
Mm,
see, and feel, and be able to tinker and be curious, as we talked about, with what's going on inside of them.
mm.
And, use that as a foundation for wherever it is that they want to go next. So it's not just like sports to do sports. It's also this like incredible opportunity to learn about who you are and what you value and how you want to show up in the world.
What a beautiful way to conclude. Thank you. So, for those, this has been amazing and I've loved it. Thank you for sharing with us today. So, for those people who want to own their power and fill their vessel with all these beautiful things that you just described with your support, where might they find you, Margaret?
Absolutely. So my website is leapmentalperformance.com. You can find a whole bunch of information there about my programming. You can just sign up for a chat with me if you want to sign up for a chat. But that's the container for all of my mental performance work is the website.
We'll find you there.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you for joining us today for such an enriching conversation.
Thank you so much. It was lovely to be here. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. Same here. Bye for now.